What's going on, everyone? This is the Noah Gillian Show, and I, of course, am your host, Noah Gillian. So happy you decided to join in today. It is the 9th of August, 2023, and on today's episode, we're going to be finishing out the 2022 Fantasy Football Audit Series with the wide receiver position. Before we get into the show, please hit that subscribe button if you're joining us on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, please give the show a follow, 5-star review. Really helps the podcast grow. Also, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, or X at The Noah Gillian Show. You can find me on Twitter at Noah Gillian and Instagram at NoahGill1. You can see all those handles in the description below. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So continuing on with our fantasy football audit series, we're going to be reviewing the wide receiver ranks from last year that I put together, and we're going to see what went wrong, what went right, and what we can learn from some of my decision making in the process. So starting off, just coming into the landscape of the wide receiver position, it has shifted quite a bit since most of us have begun playing fantasy football, at least in the last couple years for sure, as the NFL has kind of shifted to more of a passing league. It's become even more evident that some of the top wide receivers have become the more valuable players in our game than the incumbent, guess you could say, the running backs at that position. Now, this generally, I feel like, got taken to a new level in 2021 with the emergence of Cooper Kupp. Not technically the emergence, but the, hey, I'm here, I am the number one player in fantasy. Yes, that is including quarterbacks. For Cooper Kupp to have that kind of year, really opened a lot of people's eyes, I feel like. He led the league in receptions, yards, and touchdowns from the wide receiver position, won the Triple Crown, and he also scored more fantasy points in PPR scoring than any quarterback in the league, and it was absolutely unbelievable. Let me see if I can pull up. Cooper Kupp had 439 total points in 2021. The number one quarterback that year, Josh Allen, had 417, and no other quarterback had more than 400. When you're talking about the wide receiver position, Cooper Kupp had, like I mentioned, 439 points. He cleared the number two receiver almost by a full 100 points. So the difference between Cooper Kupp and the number two wide receiver, Davante Adams, was about 90 fantasy points, almost 100. Before you get to the difference between the number 2 and 100 points from there was the number 13, 14 wide receiver. So you're talking about the gap Cooper Kupp put up between number 1 and number 2 was the same as the gap between number 2 and number 14, which is absolutely ridiculous. This is in 2021, by the way, and the quarterbacks, they still had a lot of consistent production as well. But the wide receivers absolutely went off. There was a number of wide receivers over the 300-point threshold. And just to illustrate kind of how that looked in terms of running backs, there was only 3 running backs that cleared the 300-point threshold in 2021, as opposed to the wide receiver position that had 5, and 1 that was just a couple points off of it. As we kind of got through the season this last year, it was interesting to see that trend continue. And as we get into the year this season, it's showing another similar trend in average draft position for the wide receivers. You're talking about Justin Jefferson potentially being the number 1 overall pick. Not since Antonio Brown has there really been a legit discussion, I feel like, for having that wide receiver at the number 1 overall spot. However, Justin Jefferson has done that. And he's also up there with Jamar Chase and the aforementioned Cooper Kupp. Those guys are, in a lot of leagues, going 1, 2, and 3 at the top. Not even the greatness of Christian McCaffrey or the greatness of Austin Eckler that we've touched on in our last episode, touching on the running backs. Not even those two can unseat these 3 guys at the top of drafts. And it doesn't stop there. As we make our way through the first round, there's a number of names that just dominate the proceedings. Whether we're talking about Tyreek Hill, whether we're talking about Stefon Diggs, whether we're talking about Davante Adams, whether we're talking about Ceedee Lamb, A.J. Brown, a number of these guys are in that first round consideration. And you're talking about more than half of it is going to be dominated by the wide receiver position, when historically it's been the running backs. It's been the scarcity of the position and the dominance of the running back position that has been valued in the first round. And I think in general, the pool of players playing fantasy football has gotten much sharper. I think go 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, the average player, I think, is much sharper than they were at that point. You get, one way to kind of test that hypothesis is with quarterbacks. A lot of people would neglect the rushing quarterback and would neglect the late round guys. And that's when people would just feast. That's why that was my strategy, my general strategy for a number of years, to wait on quarterback and, get some rushing guys that can contribute. And now you look up and Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and Jalen Hurts, the top 3 quarterbacks, are in the second round. And that the lethality, the strength of those top guys is starting to be valued more, because people are understanding that you could really, really compete and win with those elite level quarterbacks. And that didn't always used to be the case. I mean, last year in our in a league that I'm in, Patrick Mahomes, I believe, went in the 4th round. And now he's going in the 2nd. I took Jalen Hurts in another league I was in the 6th round last year. There was a number of quarterbacks that went decently early last year. I mean, Josh Allen was the number 21 overall player off the board, and he was the first quarterback. So you're talking about back of the 2nd round. And then Patrick Mahomes was the front of the 3rd. Justin Herbert's went in the 3rd. Lamar Jackson was 3rd, 4th. Kyler Murray was 4th. Jalen Hurts was 5th, 6th. So you're kind of seeing the quarterback starting to get moved up. A lot of people are really liking that. And you're seeing the same go for the wide receiver position. Now, when it comes to the wide receiver position from last year, let's start to work our way through the ranks that I made last year and just see what we can gather. I say this every episode. I think it's just not necessarily that we're trying to take victory laps, or I'm really trying to air out all my mistakes, or I don't even know if the exercise is helpful for a lot of people. But I do think that just talking about the position year to year, especially an unbiased ranking of not really looking at a bunch of other rankings, just making my own and kind of using my ranks to discover maybe some biases that I might have. Even just looking through this list, I can also kind of talk. I mean, I can kind of see some names that, we might fall into that bucket. I just think it's a good experiment to run, even for yourself, year over year. Talk about even just writing a few names down of guys that you really like, and then going back the next year and saying, okay, well, why? And it's probably a better exercise just to write down the names and say, well, why did I like these guys so much? And then see how they finished. I think it's just a good exercise to run. So let's talk about the wide receiver ranks that I had. My final ranks, August 22nd is when they were dated. 2022, we'll talk about our ranks here. So starting off, we already kind of touched on Cooper Kupp. He was my number 1 receiver coming into last year. Anybody that had it any other way was more than likely lying. Or anticipating a monster breakout from Justin Jefferson, which can't say that they were wrong. He was an absolute freak, and he was the number 1 wide receiver last season by a healthy margin. So Cooper Kupp, I had number 1. Cooper Kupp absolutely dominated this year. He finished the year as the wide receiver number 23, and that is only playing 9 games. considering he left the one game early, call it 8 games. So in 8 games, he put up 200 fantasy points, which is just absolute. That's not even half a season. And he put up 200 fantasy points. It's just absolutely unbelievable. Some players that played the entire year, Garrett Wilson had 215 fantasy points last year, played every single game last year. Michael Pittman Jr. had 216 fantasy points, played every single game last year. And they were 20 and 21, respectively. Cooper Kupp averaged 22.4 fantasy points per game last year, was more than anybody else in the entire league, number 1 at the possession. So he's a guy, as long as he's healthy coming into the year, he has a hamstring injury, that he's going to be right up there again. And coming off the monster year he had in 2021, there was no other place for me, at least, to put him the number 1. Justin Jefferson, I had at number 2. I think everyone kind of had that 1, 2. A lot of people had Jefferson above Kupp. I chose to go with Kupp 1 and Jefferson number 2, and that takes away nothing from Justin Jefferson. He was, coming into the year, the number 2 wide receiver off of ADP. It was pretty much Kupp and Jefferson, so everyone was pretty much on that. They were both top 6 overall selections. Kupp was about going number 4, and Jefferson was going about number 6 in ADP. And he delivered for fantasy owners. He had 368 points last year. He had 39 points in week 1. He had multiple 30-point performances. I see 6 just off the top of my head reading down this list, at least 6 performances of 30+. And then you talk about his down-the-stretch performance in terms of weeks 12 through 16. He went 29, 18, 33, 30, 31. So absolutely dominated when you needed him most. Now, if you played into week 17, he did have 2.5 fantasy points in week 17, so that was a massive gut punch for Justin Jefferson owners. That stung. It absolutely had to sting. But overall, he was the wide receiver 1 on the year. He averaged 21.7 fantasy points, so there's not too much more that we need to say. He's a stud. He's going potentially number 1 overall in every fantasy draft this year. He deserves to be ranked at the top as such. Number 3, I had Ja'Marr Chase. Now, Ja'Marr Chase ended up finishing the year as the wide receiver 11, averaged 18.6 fantasy points per game. In terms of averages, that came out to the 5th highest average per game for fantasy points. Now, Ja'Marr ended up missing 4 weeks of the year. He also had a 0 in week 17. I'm not sure if he missed that due to health concerns. I would have to check that, but pretty much 5 games he had 0 points. So you're talking about 12 games that he was playing, or 11 games, with the bye. So 6 games he didn't put anything for your team. Other than that, he put up 242 fantasy points. Even the game that he left early with the calf injury that sidelined him for 5 weeks, he had 33 fantasy points in that game. So Ja'Marr Chase is an absolute beast. He's got Joe Burrow throwing him the ball. T. Higgins on the other side keeps enough attention away from him to be able to dominate in the fashion that he does. And he is just an absolute efficiency freak. He had a ridiculous efficiency in the red zone last year, scoring touchdowns at a number of targets in the red zone. And also upside for a lot more room. He only had just over 100 targets last year. And the fact that a guy like that has a lot more room to grow in terms of targets, I think it will continue to grow. And the fact that he's going in the top 3 overall picks this year, he deserves to be included in the conversation with Justin Jefferson and Cooper Kupp. When you talk about being attached to an offense like that, and with the talent that Ja'Marr possesses, it's fine. We're kind of, picking hairs at this point of the thing. So Kupp, Jefferson, Chase, definitely in a tier at the top there. Number 4 and 5, I had Stefon Diggs and Davante Adams. Diggs came in at number 4, so kind of hit that right on the head. And then Davante Adams was actually the number 3 overall wide receiver last year. Davante Adams was an absolute monster last year. I believe he had double-digit amount of touchdowns, over 20-plus yards last year. So you're talking about a guy that was a monster down the field. Derek Carr would go to him early and often, especially as the games wore on too, and go to him down the field. It's going to be interesting to see if Jimmy Garoppolo can reciprocate that type of down the field prowess, because that's something that Derek Carr really, really excelled at. and something that Jimmy Garoppolo has kind of been teased, I guess you could say, for not really being able to push the ball down the field. I think about the throw to Emmanuel Sanders in the Super Bowl every time I think of Jimmy Garoppolo. Like, he had Emmanuel Sanders running seam right down the middle of the field against the Kansas City Chiefs, I believe in 19 for the Super Bowl, and it was late in the fourth quarter and just overthrows him. And it's just, he's been good enough to get you there, but just really hasn't been good enough to be the reason why you're winning. So it's going to be interesting to see. I still have Davante Adams up there. I think he is just technically maybe the best wide receiver in the league. So his inclusion up here is warranted. He's pushing 30 right now, and this is part of the time, that year 8 mark, that year 9 in the NFL, when you start to see statistical decline in some of these players. Now, Davante Adams, I think, is a unique circumstance because of just his technicality and his just overall skill. I think he will age well. Down the field wise, maybe it won't be as prolific for him, but I do think PPR wise, off the ball, slants, curls, double moves, screens, I think Davante Adams is still going to feast in this Las Vegas offense, and he deserves to be up there. I mean, he just put up the number 3 overall finish in terms of wide receivers last year, and I had him number 5, so we were pretty in line with that. We were all about the Derek Carr Davante Adams pairing coming into the year last year, and it did not disappoint. I had Deebo Samuel at number 6. Now this one I think I fell into a little bit of recency bias with Deebo Samuel. In 2021, Deebo Samuel was the number 3 wide receiver in all of fantasy, and saying wide receiver probably isn't really fair because 2021 was when he really dominated on the ground, and he really found that as a monster outlet for his fantasy usage. He didn't really have that last year. They went to it a little bit, but by the time that Christian McCaffrey was on board, you could really see a downturn in his efficiency. He also struggled with some injuries last year as well, and just didn't really have that explosive output. He finished 38th in terms of wide receiver scoring. He averaged 13 fantasy points a game, so that's right around guys like Mike Williams, Chris Olave, Jerry Jeudy, Garrett Wilson. So still a good average. Michael Pittman Jr., still a good average. Brandon Ayuk, Terry McLaurin, but you didn't really have those spike weeks. His highest point was 23. Only had 2 games in which he went over 20 fantasy points. He had 3 games where he was in single digits, 4 games, where he was in single digits. And then he also missed 4 weeks and then 5, including the bye. So, it wasn't a phenomenal year. I do think I suffered a little bit from recency bias in there. The emergence of Brandon Ayuk was something that I've always been waiting for. I'm a really big fan of Brandon Ayuk and his potential, his athleticism, his skill. But Deebo, with his rushing ability, I think just blinded a little bit of my ranks. Would I have included him in the top 10? More than likely. I think he was definitely warranted and deserving of being in the top 10 coming into last year. 6 may have been a little bit aggressive, but honestly, I'll stand by it because of the great year that he had. They were still talking about rushing coming into last year. They renegotiated his contract to where there was incentives for rushing milestones. So you kind of assumed like, hey, listen, there's incentives for the player to get carries. Now, maybe you could say there's some conspiracy theories that they took carries away because of the incentives, so they didn't have to pay him. But now we're getting into NFL loopholes and the Illuminati here, so we're gonna stay away from there. But it's gonna be really, really interesting to see where he slots in this year, because he's definitely gonna be going as a wide receiver too. And if he has another good year, I mean, San Francisco is looking to be really, really good, a Super Bowl contender. He can make a lot of people happy. So we'll see where he goes. Number 7, I had Ceedee Lamb. Ceedee ended up finishing at number 5. Just an absolute freight train of a year. He had 300 fantasy points, so he was able to cross that 300 threshold. And just a super consistent year. I'm looking down his stat line here. He had 3 games of single-digit fantasy points, and one of those was in week 1, and then he had his other 2 single-digit fantasy performances were in week 11 and week 14, and they were 9 and 8 respectively. So This guy had an absolutely phenomenal year. I mean, I'll just read it off, just list incoming for the listeners. I mean, he went from week 2 on, he went 15, 22, 21, 10, 12, 10, 18. Goes into the bye. Comes out of the bye. 38, 9, 17, 20, 8, 19, 34, 21. Those 34 and 21 were in week 16 and 17, 16 in week 18. So, like, you're talking about a guy who was extremely consistent, fought through the injury to Dak Prescott. During that time where Dak was hurt, he didn't have a ton of great games. He had some good games for sure, but still was able to produce with Cooper Rush under center. So another guy who's going to continue to be ranked up here. I think he's the guy who's definitely going to hop Deebo in the ranks coming in next year. Could potentially even hop a guy like Davante Adams, depending on if that's something that you're interested in. The change of Kellen Moore from the offensive coordinator position in Dallas is something to monitor. It is not nothing that Kellen Moore is not there anymore. They were one of the past happiest teams in the leagues. They were one of the fastest teams in terms of pace of play in Dallas. So the fact that those numbers we anticipate are going to be coming down, that's just something you got to look out for. However, the talent of Ceedee Lamb is undeniable. Dak Prescott's healthy coming into the year. If Zach Martin hopefully shows up to camp for them, that would be huge for them, and even better for Ceedee to give Dak some time to get him the ball. As we move on here, number 8, I had Mike Evans. Interesting year for Mike Evans. He ended up finishing, where did he finish? I had to have passed him. Yeah, he finished 17. Mike Evans finished 17, was very, very inconsistent. It was not a fun ride if you owned Mike Evans. Count me in. I traded for him in a couple leagues. He cleared the 30-point mark twice, so more than a lot of guys in the league. He also put up 48 in week 17 in championship weeks, if you could even have gotten there with Mike Evans on your team. It was really, really up and down. He's a guy that usually gets a lot of touchdowns. He cleared the 1,000-yard mark again. Tom Brady just didn't really have a great year. The whole offense in general, they scored about the 31st most touchdowns in the league, or I think they scored 31 touchdowns. Excuse me. So they were very, very far down in terms of scoring output. And there was also a number of plays. I mean, Mike Evans dropped a couple long passes for touchdowns I can remember off the top of my head. But still a guy who is one of the best receivers in the league, just flat out. I mean, he's had 1,000 yards in every single year he's been in the NFL for Tampa Bay. And he's a guy who catches touchdowns routinely. He's a guy that's always feasted on getting in the end zone. So 8 may have been a little aggressive. I want to see where he finished in 2021 and see where that. Mike Evans finished at number 9 in 2021. Was still up and down, was a little bit more consistent because Tom Brady had a much better 21 than 22. However, it really fell off last year. He's going to be way outside the top 10 now. But I think that was kind of the reason. Tom Brady even threw the ball the most in the league last year too, had one of the most yards in the league. And, Mike Evans still finished at the 17. So honestly, it ended up being not that bad, but this is like the Joe Mixon effect we were talking about last year. I mean, Mike Evans had a game with 48 fantasy points. He had another game with 30 fantasy points. He failed to break 18 points in any other game of the year, and he had single digits in a number of games, more than 5, and that's not including a week 3 game he missed and the bye week, of course. He also missed week 18 as well. But they were sitting all their starters. Obviously, they had the division, or they had the week 18 clinched. So, as we move to the back end of the top 10, Tyreek Hill, number 9. This one was probably my biggest, one of my bigger misses, I guess you could say. I had him number 9. He did finish number 2, though. Tyreek was just an absolute freak this year. Super consistent, super dominant, had big spike weeks, and also just consistently performed. Averaged 20 points. Had 341 fantasy points last year. This is a guy who's going in the middle of the first round this year. As long as Tua Tagovailoa stays healthy, I think he'll be even better and be more consistent. Now, Jaylen Waddle is a wide receiver who does a lot better when Tua was in. And when Tua was out, Tyreek was still getting the ball and was still dominating. So it's going to see interesting to see how that balance kind of plays out. But in terms of Tyreek Hill, he is fully in his prime. He is fully in his prime and dominating. This offense revolves around him. He got paid. He's going to get the ball. He's the number one on an explosive offense with a creative play caller. I feel like there's not really much more to say for Tyreek than that. He is going to be up there. He is probably going to be in the top 5 as we come into this year with my ranks again. Number 10, I had Keenan Allen. Now, Keenan Allen, this is a soft spot for me. I love Keenan Allen. He's one of my favorite receivers in the league. I think he's just an absolute beast. He's just a monster. He missed a lot of time last year. Let's just call it what it was. He had a great week 1. He was having a great week 1. Got hurt in that game. He ended up missing 5 straight games. Came back. Only had 3 fantasy points in week 7. And I believe he left that game again. They had the bye week, and then he missed 2 games. But then when he came back, he was Keenan Allen. He went from weeks 11 on through week 18. He went 12, 15, 20, 21, 16, 21, 11, 30 for an average of 16.4 fantasy points per game. And that's including the 3.1 that he had in week 7 and the 10.6 he had in week 1. And when you talk about 16.4 fantasy points, that's right on par with guys like DeAndre Hopkins, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who was the number 7 wide receiver fantasy. He had a higher average than Jaylen Waddle, Devontae Smith, Amari Cooper, these guys like that. And he is just one of the best wide receivers in the league. There's just absolutely no doubt that that Keenan Allen is that guy. I expect him to be highly ranked again coming into this year. As I talked about with Dallas, they no longer have Kellen Moore, offensive coordinator who likes to play fast. He is now in Los Angeles with those Chargers. Now, a lot of people are concerned about Quentin Johnston, the wide receiver from TCU they took in the first round. Obviously, Josh Palmer last year was their wide receiver 3. He's still there. They still have Mike Williams. So a lot of people may be like, it's a crowded wide receiver room. Austin Eckler gets targets. They have tight ends, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, Keenan Allen is one of the best route runners in the league. He will consistently get open no matter who's on him, and Justin Herbert loves Keenan Allen. It's just a fact of the Chargers over Justin Herbert's career that he's been in LA. Keenan Allen consistently finds way to get open. He is a PPR machine. Now, because he is so technical in tight spaces, he's not that guy like Davante Adams who's going to go down the field and catch those 20-yard touchdown passes. He can score. He has gotten up to 7-8 touchdowns in a season, but he's more like that 4 to 5 guy per year. So there is a situation where you could talk me out of Keenan Allen, like, oh, well, Mike Williams probably more of a touchdown guy. Quentin Johnston maybe gets more touchdowns. Josh Palmer, more down the field guys. But at the end of the day, Keenan Allen is a guy that you're going to love having on your fantasy team. He is a set it and forget it. He is someone who you do not have to worry about in your wide receiver 2 slot. He is just going to be there consistently. He's a perfect guy to match with a guy that's like an explosive player, like an A.J. Brown, a Jamar Chase. These guys, Davante Adams from last year, like these guys are explosive. And Keenan Allen is just super consistent. And who knows, maybe the ball bounces this way this year and he scores 8, 9, 10 touchdowns. In that case, he's going to be a top 10 wide receiver that you are not paying a top 10 price for. So that's why I love Keenan so much. And I think he's just an absolute stud. Rounding out the top 12 here, I had A.J. Brown at number 11 and Michael Pittman Jr. at number 12. I'll start with Michael Pittman real quick just because I was all in on Michael Pittman Jr. last year. I was buying the Kool-Aid. I was drinking the Kool-Aid. I was buying all kinds of stock in Michael Pittman. And it was a underwhelming ride. He still finished number 20 in terms of wide receivers. He had 216 points, averaged 13.5 fantasy points a game. Started off with 27 points in week 1, missed week 2, and then came back with 15. So was doing really well. But then just really struggled to have those spike weeks throughout the rest of the year. He had 26 in week 6, but then failed to reach 20 for the rest of the year. Only hit 19 a couple times, really didn't get over that 15-point mark for very much, so didn't really have that upside, and a lot of that came from the quarterback position, struggling in Indianapolis. Now, they brought in Anthony Richardson, obviously, in the draft. They bring in Gardner Minshew. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. He will definitely be falling down my ranks a little bit more. Still a really good talent that I like a lot in terms of Michael Pittman Jr., but at the end of the day, rookie quarterbacks, they just rarely support these dominant players. Now we expect Jonathan Taylor to still be explosive, but even he's kind of falling a little bit in the ranks, and maybe Gardner starts week 1 or week 2, and then Anthony Richardson comes in, and we'll see. I'm sure he's going to have some good games this year, but I'm just a little bit nervous over his potential. Now talking about AJ Brown here, I had him at number 11. He ended up finishing at number 6. I mean, everyone knows what AJ did last year. Just an absolute freak. I mean, I believe he had almost 1,300 yards and like 10 touchdowns last year. I'm going to pull up his stats from last year to see if we can get it. Yeah. Excuse me. 1,500 yards and 11 touchdowns. Absolute freak. He had 145 targets, which is 40 more than his previous career high, hauled in 88 of them, played all 17 games, something that he did not do in his entire career. He played 16 games his rookie year, so played a full season then, but then 14, 13, was always nicked up, had a couple injuries, missed a couple games. Then he played all 17 games last year, so was just an absolute freak. I didn't want to slot him in too high, and this is where I think I had an initial bias, because I was really, really in on AJ Brown, and maybe it was just because I didn't want to come across too homerish with AJ Brown and being on the Eagles and everything, but he is just an absolute monster. I expect a full repeat of that last year. He had 1,511. Maybe he doesn't have 1,500 yards last year or next year, but I think he could have 15 plus touchdowns, and maybe he doesn't have 11 touchdowns. Maybe he only has 7 or 8, but could see him putting up another 1,500, 1,600 yards. Like, that is just the way in which he's built. That's the way in which the offense runs. That's the way in which he's been performing all training camp. And honestly, with a quarterback like Jalen Hurts and an offense like the Philadelphia Eagles have, the only thing I can really see that's going to, bring him down at all is injury. And it has been something that's been in his past. But without that, you're talking about a guy who is as physical as any wide receiver in the league, is as fast as most of the wide receivers in the league. I'm not going to say he's as fast as Tyreek Hill or someone like that, but he's right there. And you're talking about a guy who has as good of hands as anybody in the league. He might not be a technical route runner like Davante Adams, Keenan Allen, Stefon Diggs, but he is just a physical freak, and he will be higher than 11. You can guarantee that. So that's going to wrap up our wide receiver ones. So those were the wide receivers. I had wide receiver ones, and we'll get into the back half of the top 24 now. Number 13, I had T. Higgins. Now, T came off a year in 2021 in which he was a beast. He had a number of really, really good games down the stretch, and a lot of people were anticipating that breakout, and that breakout didn't necessarily come. I mean, he still had another wide receiver 2 year. He came up a couple slots. He finished at 18. Had a number of really, really good games, especially when Jamar Chase went down. He really stepped up and carried the load. But just with the presence of Jamar Chase there, it's always going to cap his upside a little bit. Maybe if Jamar goes down, then T can step up there. But I do view him a little bit lower potentially than this 13 there. Number 14, I had Mike Williams. Now, I was extremely high on Mike Williams coming into the year last year. I was extremely high on the Chargers in general. And Mike Williams just had a typical Mike Williams year. I mean, he missed about 4 games due to injury. He had as many 20-point games as he did single-digit scoring games. He had 4 20-point games, and he had 5 single-digit point scoring games. So that's just the guy who Mike Williams is. He's going to be ranked a little bit lower for me. That's not saying he got any worse or my opinion on him necessarily has changed. It just comes down to the fact that he is a boomer bust wide receiver. He goes deep. He throws his body around. It's going to get nicked up throughout the year. He's going to miss 4 games this year, 3 or 4 games this year. But some of the games that he plays, he is going to go out and absolutely dominate in those games. So he's going to be someone, I'm not really expecting consistency to be added to his game at this point of his career. Jaylen Waddle, I had at number 15. Now, the Dolphins as a whole really balled out last year. Jaylen Waddle ends up last year finishing as the number 8 wide receiver. Averaged 15 points a game, 259 total points. Had a number of monster weeks. He had a 40-point week in there. He had a 30-point week in there. A couple 20s. Was generally consistent. But like I said, when Tua missed some games, you could see he had a back-to-back 5-point games. He had a 1-point game followed by a 5-point game. Specifically when Tua was out in those games. But when he was playing, Jaylen Waddle got the ball and he was extremely consistent. So Jaylen Waddle is definitely going to end up being higher than 15, I believe, in my ranks coming into next year. But this is a team that has 2 elite wide receivers, much like the Eagles, much like the Bengals. They have legit wideouts on the outside, maybe the best tandem in the league. All right, now number 16, I had Cortland Sutton. Now, this was probably my biggest miss of the year. I thought he was going to be a legit wide receiver 2 with wide receiver 1 potential. And let's just talk about where Cortland Sutton finished. Cortland Sutton finished at number 43. Now, didn't start terrible at all. He went 11, 19, 17, 16, which is not bad for where he was going. Let's talk about where his ADP was coming into the year. Cortland Sutton was the number 22 wide receiver off the board, wide receiver 2 going around pick 56 overall. Was going about 22 on ESPN, 18 on Sleeper. And he ended up finishing at 43, like I mentioned, but I had him at 16. So I was over ADP. I had him higher. I thought he was going to finish as a high-end wide receiver 2. And he absolutely, along with Denver in general, just totally pooped the bed and didn't show up. He's kind of like Mike Williams in a sense, which is funny. I had a build last year where I had Mike Williams and Cortland Sutton as my 2 wide receivers. I was expecting consistency. I was expecting breakouts from both of them. And if I didn't draft Jalen Hurts in the 6th round, I may have gone winless. That just shows you the league, the build that I had last year. However, he's going to be much lower this year. Denver did lose Tim Patrick coming into this year. However, I just don't know. I think Jerry Jeudy is just going to take over him, honestly. I was always, last year I was Team Sutton over Jeudy coming into the year. I was Team Sutton over Jeudy, but now it just seems that Jeudy is kind of really coming into his own. Sean Payton really trusts him. Russell Wilson appears to and is being reported that he still has a great rapport with, Russell Wilson. However, Russell Wilson and Cortland Sutton. However, Jeudy, is a favorite of Sean Payton. And Sutton just hasn't really ever done it. We've been waiting for this breakout. And at this point in his career, I'm just going to expect him to be what he's been. A deep threat, a semi-consistent player, but not someone who you can really rely on to be a wide receiver 2. He's a flex option coming into the year. I had Adam Thielen at number 17. Now, worse than my Cortland Sutton may have been this Adam Thielen pick. Honestly, he didn't finish that low. He finished number 30. Okay, so better than I thought. Wide receiver 3 at least. And he had a couple games where he was doing pretty well, but just still, it seemed to have really lost the step. He left the team in Minnesota who threw a ton, and goes to a team in Carolina who's going to have a rookie quarterback. Also, there's going to be some targets vacated with DJ Moore not there, but we kind of saw he lost a step last year a little bit, and I'm not expecting him to be a wide receiver 2 this year. I think he's going to be another guy who's going to be in that flex consideration. DK Metcalf, I had at number 18. Now, DK had a great year, ended up finishing at 16. Pretty consistent, averaged 13 points, and was usually around that. After week 2, we went 17, 21, 17, 5, 2, 17, 14, 13, by 20, 26, 18, 12, 15. So really was pretty consistent in a bounce back year for Geno Smith, the whole offense in general. DK, I want to see where he was going in ADP. So DK Metcalf was going 19th overall, or 19th at the wide receiver position, and 47th overall. And this was a year after, in 2021, where he finished as the 14th wide receiver. Was only a point or two away from being a top 12 wide receiver. It was 2 points behind Mike Williams, who was a top 12 wide receiver last year, in 2021. And then coming into this year with Geno Smith as the quarterback, everyone seemed to kind of be like, I think he might get a little bit worse. And, he went at the 19 and he finished as the 16. So, it was kind of a decent categorization. I guess that's how you say that. And we were right there. I mean, he finished 16. We had him at 18. He was going right around 19. So he was kind of that mid wide receiver too. But I think a lot of people got good value on him at the 47th overall pick as his wide receiver 2. Pretty consistent, maybe even a wide receiver 3 if some people went that route with the build. I'm rising on him coming into the year. I'm in on Geno Smith. They picked up Jackson Smith and Jigba, so a lot of people may say that's going to hurt DK. I think it's really going to help the offense in general move the ball and get into the red zone more, which is where DK is just going to eat. So while I do really like Jackson Smith and Jigba, I like his draft value. While I really like Tyler Lockett, a guy who just always gets it done, I really like DK as well. And I think he's going to really, really show up. And I think he's gonna perform at a mid wide receiver 2 range and potentially push wide receiver 1 status this year. All right, I had Chris Godwin at 19, and he finished right at 19. Cha-ching. So we got a couple guys we've hit right on the nail on the head. This one was another one with Tom Brady. I was really excited about him, and I think you can see he was a little bit more consistent than Mike Evans. He's kind of the perfect complement to him, more of a chain mover, more of a short route guy. Really didn't have any blow up weeks like Mike Evans last year had a game of 30 points and 48 points. Chris Godwin only had 2 games over 20 points, but was just super consistent. Once he came back from his injury, he came into the year off an ACL injury, ended up playing week 1, missed a couple weeks after that, but then when he came back, from week 4 on, he went 13, 12, 15, 11, 13, 10, 19. Then he went to the bye. Then he had 29, 14, 10, 23, 14. So a really, really consistent wide receiver 2. Low end in terms of where he finished in terms of being 19. Kind of that mid-range, actually. Just a super consistent. I think he will survive the quarterback downgrade better than Mike Evans will, strictly because of the routes and in the spaces in which Tampa Bay will use him. I think that he should and will be higher ranked than Mike Evans coming to the year because the short yardage, the chain mover, that is a lot easier to hit on than the deep balls in which Mike Evans thrives on. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to keep track of. I think he's going to be honestly ranked in a similar position, maybe a tiny bit lower, coming into the year, and we'll see where he slots in. Allen Robinson, I had at number 20. This was probably my biggest miss of the year. I talked about Tyreek a little bit and Cortland Sutton, but there is no doubt that everybody in the fantasy community can share this sentiment that Allen Robinson was probably one of the worst calls all of us had coming into the year. Now, Allen Robinson was going to Los Angeles. Let's just paint the picture for Allen Robinson. Leaving Chicago, going to Los Angeles, and was finally going to have a quarterback that can get him the ball, that can really allow him to come into his own and be a very, very consistent wide receiver that we have seen. Because in his career, he's always been a guy who was, everyone kind of said, he's just a quarterback away from being a really dominant player. And he showed it in Jacksonville. He was able to really, really step up and play really well. And in Chicago, it never quite happened for him. But at the same time, you still saw flashes all the time of Allen Robinson's skill set. And finally, with Matt Stafford, everyone was like, listen, this is going to be really good. And Allen Robinson finished as the 84th wide receiver in fantasy. Just absolutely disgusting performance from him. He's now with Pittsburgh. So it's going to be interesting to see how I feel like he's totally fallen off the map. Nobody even really talks about Allen Robinson anymore. They got a deep wide receiver room in Pittsburgh with Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, Allen Robinson now. So it'll be interesting to see where he finds out. I just went in 2021 and was looking for him to see if I could reference it, and I couldn't even find him on the scoring chart too. So I think that he is going to fall way off. But that was just a big miss. I think the main reason why I had him there was the thought of Matt Stafford, thinking he could replace that Odell and Robert Woods role from 2021, and it just never really ended up coming to fruition. And then once Stafford went down, it was pretty much just, it wasn't happening for him. So rounding out the top 24, I had DJ Moore at 21. DJ Moore actually finished at 24. So he was kind of right in that back end wide receiver 2 range. Another guy who was pretty consistent, even on a bad team. Down the stretch from weeks 15, 16, 17. So you're talking about the fantasy playoffs. He went 18, 20, 23. So a guy who, showed some promise, had a couple games where he really disappeared. But now in Chicago, a lot of people are really, really excited for his potential. A lot of people are comping DJ Moore going to Chicago with, Stefon Diggs going to Buffalo, with A.J. Brown going to Philly, with, all these wide receivers switching teams, Tyreek Hill going to Miami. I don't think he's on that level, but he is right below that level in terms of DJ Moore's talent. He is a absolute freak at the wide receiver position. And I think he's honestly going to slot in a similar spot coming into next year. But yeah, it was a decent rank. Had him at 21, finished at 24. Had Brandin Cooks at 22. Now, Brandin Cooks obviously playing for the Houston Texans last year. Finished at number 49. Dealt with injuries throughout the year. Still averaged 11 fantasy points per game. So definitely a pretty solid wide receiver 3 kind of tally there. But now in Dallas, I don't know. I feel like he really doesn't get talked about at all. And yet this is a guy who has put up 1,000-yard seasons on every single team he's been with, no matter what team it's, whether it's the Patriots, whether it's the Rams, whether it's the Texans, all these teams he's gone to, puts up 1,000 yards, good wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. So, I had him at 22. He finished 30-something. I anticipate this, where was he going last year? Brandin Cooks was going 20th off the board, so was kind of similar in that range. So did not live up to ADP, but this is a guy in the Dallas offense who potentially could make some noise. I had Jerry Jeudy at number 23, and I had Marquis Hollywood Brown at 24. Jerry Jeudy was going as the number 27 wide receiver off the board last year, and Marquise Brown was going as the number 25 wide receiver off the board. So kind of right in that range. Jerry Jeudy ended up finishing as the 22nd wide receiver, so I was one spot off there. And then Marquise Hollywood Brown, where did he finish? Marquise Brown finished at number 44. And but Marquise did have a great year because DeAndre Hopkins missed the first 6 weeks of the year last year. And then right when DeAndre Hopkins came back, Marquise Brown got injured. So it kind of matched up perfectly. But in the 6 weeks that DeAndre Hopkins was not there, Marquise Brown went 14, 12, 28, 20, 21, 11. So averaged right in that high teens area, and was Kyler's preferred choice. They played together in college, but when he came back and DeAndre Hopkins was still there and it was Colt McCoy, he's putting up 7, 5, 8, 12, 1, like really wasn't performing that well. Arizona were expecting to be an absolute dumpster fire this year, so I don't know really necessarily where his value is going to be. Maybe they'll have to be throwing a lot, and he's really the only wide receiver, so he could be a PPR guy. But I think he's gonna be more of a wide receiver 3 than a wide receiver 2. All right, so that wraps up our top 24 that I had some ranks. I also had a number of names right outside the top 24 who I wrote down. A couple of names who I wrote down, which I definitely should have included in this top 24. Terry McLaurin, ended up finishing as the wide receiver 14. He was the next name off my list. Then I had Davante Smith, who had finished at wide receiver 9. I had him right off the list. Tyler Lockett was the next name. So the top 3 names I had all finished in the top 24 right after the top. They finished all in the top 14, and these were the first 3 names I had off the top 24. I also had Gabe Davis in this mix. He ended up really not breaking out to the level that a lot of people were expecting. I had Amon-Ra St. Brown in this list as well, and he was number 7. So it was crazy. And then I also had Juju Smith-Schuster, who finished at 27. I had Elijah Moore, who totally fell out of favor in New York. And then Darnell Mooney, who had a decent year, was a wide receiver 3/4, and really didn't do anything. But overall, I mean, 4 of the 8 guys that I had in this outside list finished as top 14 options. So that just kind of shows you the depth and why we do this. Because in this range, like, let's talk about ADP real quick, because that makes it okay. So Amon-Ra St. Brown went number 21 overall out of wide receivers, 21st in terms of wide receivers, and went 61st overall. He was the number 7 wide receiver in terms of fantasy scoring last year. Devontae Smith, where did he go? Devontae Smith went 37th among wide receivers last year, number 93 overall, and he finished as the number 9 wide receiver in fantasy. Tyler Lockett went number 38th overall in terms of wide receivers, went number 96th in terms of just overall players. He finished as the number 11. He finished as the number 13 wide receiver off the board. And where did Terry McLaurin go? He probably went higher. Yeah, Terry was the 15th wide receiver off the board. So that one, I was probably a little haterish on Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin's an interesting wide receiver because he is ridiculously talented. Just one of the best like athletes at the position. And I just when I have him on my team, and I just don't really feel comfortable with him. I guess maybe it's because of the boomer bust nature of his game. But even then, I mean, last year, let's just look at his box. I mean, just terms of games, went 13, 12, 16, 3, 12, 8, 18, 16, 10, 20, 9, 9, 24, 13, 17, 5. So kind of bounced back and forth a lot. And at the end of the year, he finishes as a high-end wide receiver too, but the ride's a little bumpy, and it'll be interesting. I'm in on the Commanders this year, so maybe I should have him a little bit higher. But let's look at some other ADP, because I was down in that range. Devontae Smith, Tyler Lockett, Christian Kirk was the number 39 wide receiver off the board last year. Brandin Ayuk was the number 40 wide receiver off the board last year. Christian Kirk ended up finishing at number 12. And I mentioned with, where is he at? And Brandin Ayuk finished as the 15th wide receiver. So there is value in later in the draft at the wide receiver position. Every year they go up and down. I mean, Allen Robinson was the 26th wide receiver off the board last year. Gabe Davis was the 24th wide receiver off the board last year. And they just absolutely fell off the face of the earth. So, just to touch on a couple rookies, I didn't have any rookies in this. So that probably was a little, Garrett Wilson was the 53rd wide receiver off the board last year in terms of ADP. Chris Olave was the 44th wide receiver off the board last year, according to ADP. Both of those guys finished in the top 24. Garrett Wilson, 21, and Chris Olave actually was 25. But both those guys are expected to be breakouts this year. So I did want to touch on a couple of the rookies as we kind of touch on the wide receivers. So as we kind of wrap up and we start to think about some takes from this and this exercise, I think it's important to have misses. I think that's one thing that in terms of fantasy analysis, there's so many people doing it now that you can kind of get watered down, and you can kind of get lulled to believe certain things because other people believe them. And, I planted my flag on Cortland Sutton last year to be the 16th wide receiver. I planted my flag on Mike Williams to be higher. Where did Mike Williams go last year? I'm probably going to Mike Williams went 17th over, and I had him at 14. Cortland Sutton was going at 20, 22, and I had him at 16. you got to be willing to plant your Michael Pittman. I had at 12. He was going 13, so I guess that's not crazy. Maybe these aren't good examples. However, like Cortland Sutton, Mike Williams, I think those were two names that I was pretty up on. Even Allen Robinson was going 26th. I had him at 20th. Just these guys that I was really, really high on. And then also, guys, you got to be willing to, say go a little lower. I had DJ Moore at 21. He was going 14. Some of these guys that you can, talk about and see where they're ranked and all that stuff. But I think it's important, getting back to my point, I think it's important to be comfortable to be wrong about players, as long as your reasoning is sound and your reasoning makes sense, if that makes sense. Coming into the year, Russell Wilson going into Denver, everyone thought it was going to work. Cortland Sutton, I was banking on the rapport they were building in camp, going crazy. I'll take that loss. Everything, the tea leaves, everything I was reading was saying that, and it ended up being a miss. There was a number of things that I got wrong last year that I think I was comfortable with because I could see the outcome happening. It just didn't happen, and that's why we play the game. But I think anytime you do these exercises where you write down rankings specifically and any of that nature, you need to be willing to be wrong. So I think that's important, and it's also important to be accountable in terms of, like, why did I do it? Not just like, oh, forget about it. I'm just like, I don't even know what I was thinking, blah, blah, blah. Well, then you're not really getting better in that way. You're not getting better as a player. You're not getting better in terms of identifying values and talent and, taking advantage of certain biases that people have and all that stuff. So I think that is a really important takeaway from this. And takeaway from this entire series that I've done with the quarterbacks, the running back, and the wide receiver. Just understanding and identifying biases, potential biases, and kind of standing on that, standing on your word, standing on your ranks, and accepting when you might be wrong. I know it's not a very popular thing for people to admit, but everybody's wrong with everything they do, and nobody can predict what's going to happen in fantasy football. The only thing you can do specifically is put yourself in the best position to have the best odds to win in a given week, and that is done through, in this exercise. It's done, recording your stuff, not just thinking it and actually recording it, putting it down on paper and reviewing it, and going back to it. So I think that's really important. But overall, that is just going to wrap up our talk with the wide receiver audits. We're going to have a number of episodes coming out in August regarding fantasy football. I got a number of guests coming on. I'm going to have my 23 ranks coming out very, very soon. I just did my quarterback ranks a couple days ago. I got to update those because I missed a couple names. But then I'm going to do my running backs and wide receiver ranks, probably get those done the next couple days, and then put the episodes out in the coming weeks. We're also going to have our mega NFL preview episode that we did last year, where I had the Rams and the Broncos meeting in the Super Bowl. I guarantee you I'll have a better pick this year, so definitely stay tuned for that. But all August, there's going to be a ton of great content. I might even dabble in a little some other sports as well with baseball. Obviously, we're going to be touching on the Phils as the division races heat up and everything. Might touch on a little Premier League if some people are interested in the soccer aspect of things, something I'm really getting into of late. So, I'm excited to kind of maybe talk about that a little bit if people are into that. And just August in general is really going to heat up. We've been lulling a little bit on episodes throughout the summer, just with everything that's going on there. Just had a little less time to get on there. But as football season gears up, this is the time when we really want to lock in and start pumping episodes out. So definitely stay tuned. And that's going to do it for the show today. Also, check the description, guys, for our social media handles. Shoot us any questions. Any questions you guys have, we'll answer it on the show. So definitely shoot it any way possible on social media or whatever. And that'll do it. So thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you back here again next time.